Good morning. Welcome. My name is David. I've been hired by your company to go over a few guidelines and rules that you'll want to be aware of before heading over to your new assignment in Australia. It's very similar to the US and England and really most of the countries that you've worked with up to this point. However, there are some key and crucial differences between this culture and the one that you're used to that could prove potentially fatal to any business contacts or relationships that you may have if handled incorrectly. So let's dive into that here now. First, we're going to start with the history of Australia. Now, this great nation is relatively new to the world landscape here in terms of having its own, it's as its own separate entity. It was actually originally ruled by Aboriginal Indians back before the English settled it back in 1788. A group of English settlers set out around that time and landed in 1788 to form an actual penal colony. The purpose behind this was because of overcrowding. England just needed to move some of their prisoners, whether it be murder, thefts, even taxes. They just needed to move some of these bodies out of the English prisons. They could make room and fight overcrowding. So about 50% of those people that headed over were guilty of one crime or another. The other 50%, roughly, we're actually just looking for a new start, a new country and colony, something they could really form and prosper. So that was kind of the story behind the original settlement there. Eventually, the Aborigines and the colonists did have to come together and coexist peacefully. However, this was stoppaged originally due to the illnesses and disease that the colonists brought over, which had a very negative impact on the inhabitants of Australia. Measles, smallpox, it wiped out many of the original inhabitants, unfortunately. Fast forward a little bit to 1901 is when Australia originally became its own separate nation. This was when it actually gained independence from England and became its own sovereign state. They took a lot of their ideas behind government and what they were looking for from the English and us here in America. They're a democracy. So, and essentially what that means is that they're pro-choice, they're pro-freedom. They don't believe in controlling any sort of group of people. They believe that the masses should try to decide what is best for the country versus a small elite group doing that. And they've done a great job. They have two separate states, essentially, that make up the country of Australia. And each of those actually works together to make the laws of the land. And in a nutshell is how that works. They actually still even share a queen with England. She's both Queen of Australia and the Queen of England, funny enough. So essentially that's kind of the general picture in terms of how it was formed and then also the political landscape. So not a whole lot of difference between England and Australia and American Australia in those respects. So you should be pretty familiar with that going into it. Now let's look at the cultural heritage of Australia. Now this is going to be, up until this point, everything that's happened to it, everything that we just briefly discussed is going to play a role in the cultural heritage of Australia. And this is something as a managing leader going over there that you're going to want to be aware of. Now, the culture of Australia is similar yet different. Now, here in America, we still believe in being cut and dry, to the point, get the job done, right? Well, in Australia, they still believe in that. They've actually more than once been ranked on the global list for countries with the longest and hardest work weeks. They've been ranked right up there. However, they go about their work just a little bit differently. So they're more of a laid-back culture. They're not as uptight. They believe in working hard and getting the job done. However, they believe in incorporating humor and being very blunt. So, for instance, if you had, say, a work dispute or an argument, there was a white elephant in the room. Here, we'd be more apt, and in England, for the most part, we'd be more apt to kind of sweep that under the rug, ignore it, and move on to the next issue at hand. In Australia, if you were in that meeting and something came up along those lines, they would say something, they would be blunt about what they said, and they would make light of it. They would make a joke out of it to kind of air the room, if you will. It may be uncomfortable and it may seem very uncouth to foreigners. However, that's how things are done there. And it's to keep everything light and keep everything directed, going toward a main focusing goal. Another thing that they do is they also believe in social drinking. And that's something they do very frequently there. It's actually a very big part of their business culture as well as their social culture. Not so much in terms of binge drinking, but in terms of just social drinking. It's something that is just incorporated into the culture as a whole. They're also okay with office romances. And this would stem from, in a lot of companies that we would be familiar with, that is usually frowned upon because it can potentially hinder products, work efforts, etc. In Australia, they actually don't really mind either way. So let's say if you had a boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, whatever you will, and they're in an apartment together, as long as things are kept professional and everybody's focused the way they should be at work, nobody really cares what that person or that couple does in their own individual free time. So that's another thing that you want to be aware of. Racial is another thing in terms of cultural differences that we have here. So in a lot of cultures, it would be considered disgraceful, at the very least, to mention any sort of racial slurs or derogatory references toward any other culture, including your own. Now, in the social and the business environment, it's actually expected, but only from that ethnic group. So let's say if you were Italian, for instance, and you referred to yourself in a derogatory term when in general conversation with some of your colleagues, that would be considered appropriate and expected. However, if you were to refer to them as that same term, it would be completely out of line and inappropriate. So be aware of that, be leery of that, and try not to let it get you off guard too much. Essentially, that's kind of what you're going to be dealing with when you head into the cultural differences there. Other than that, they're going to be fairly similar. They're hardworking, they're to the point, they're easygoing, kind of everything we just covered there, but be aware of those main cultural differences in the workplace that I just discussed there. In addition to those racial terms that I just mentioned, swearing is also acceptable and expected, and it's a sign of frustration. It's something that really is a general part of their environment as well. So that's another thing that you're really going to want to be on top of. And while you may not partake, try not to be too taken back or shocked when something like that comes up in a work meeting or in the workplace in general. So moving on here to cultural attitudes and influences. Got a funny little cartoon up there. Now, cultural influences, as I mentioned before in the heritage and the history, their influences and a lot of their attitudes, like I stated previously, are going to be very similar to what we're dealing with here in America and England. Most of the time, it's going to be very, very similar. You're not really going to have to change a whole lot about anything that we do here, except for the situations that I mentioned prior. Those are crucial. And if you don't keep those in mind, it could, like I said, be detrimental to your business relationships. So keep that in mind. But other than that, attitudes, if anything, the difference in their attitudes, it's going to be more lax than what we have here. They're very hard workers, just like we are here. And most of the same things are expected, but they generally like to take it with more of a relaxed point of view. And one thing that would be potentially more important than here or in England would be timekeeping. While they do like to keep things relaxed, they're also very, very time-oriented, which means that you're going to want to be right on time for your meetings, not too early, because that's going to show that you're too eager. It's going to come across as more overbearing. And if you're late for that same meeting, it's going to come across as having less of a care for the issue at hand. And that's not going to bode well for you on either ends of the spectrum. So try to be right on time for those meetings or those time engagements, and just really do your best to keep that at the forefront of your priority list there. So that's going to be certainly the big differences between the cultural attitudes and influences of Australia. Now, moving on here, we're going to look at motivation. Now, as we know, motivation rewards. I mean, just the little diagram here kind of goes across the various aspects of motivation, right? Kind of what breeds a nice, work-friendly, motivating environment for you to really reach your goals. Now, in Australia, they have a very open environment. So unlike the United States or England, which have a tendency, not completely, as some nations in the world that are completely focused on hierarchy, but Australia tends to blur those lines even more than our two nations, and they like to keep more of a level and open playing field with all of their coworkers. So say if you walked into an environment and it was the CEO, the janitor, and middle management, right? Everybody's going to treat the other person the same, and they're not going to worry about trying to kiss up to the boss or ignore the janitor. Everyone's going to be in the same room, and they're going to be talking, and they're going to socialize, and they're going to work together. Because at the end of the day, in Australia, they recognize that there's an end goal. Everybody needs to be there and be incorporated to meet those goals, and nobody is more or less important than the other member of that team. And while in America and England, we may focus a little more on that hierarchy, and we have a tendency to think in that fashion, Australia is completely the opposite. They blur the lines, and in my opinion, they do it for good reason. It really helps bring the team together. It helps keep everybody involved, and it really helps breed a healthy, growing work environment, and it shows in their culture. And I'll go into those facts here in a little bit. They also tend to use intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And the big thing behind that, like I said, is everyone's in it together. Well, while they do everyone needs to make money to pay their bills, just like anywhere else that we work, they cover those extrinsics. But they really dive into the intrinsic. And the reason I say that is because, like I said, everybody treats everyone with that common respect, which is mandatory. They have those common goals, which everybody shares, and they ensure that there is a proper work-life balance. Everybody in Australia is given a mandated 20 days of holiday every year, in addition to the original holidays that the nation celebrates. And this is to keep that classic work-life play balance. So you have the leadership, which has dictated that this is mandatory for the well-being of their clients. So they expect to have 110%. They expect their employees to give their all, but in turn, they also realize that their employees need to recharge, unplug, so when they come back to their jobs and they come back to the things that they truly believe in, and the Australians are generally very involved with their careers, and they are very intimately involved with not just the paychecks, but also the end goals of their companies. And management knows and they see that giving them that rest time gives them the benefits they need to come back and really dive right back into ensuring their company meets those goals and making sure everything is on track. So really everything in this, like in this diagram here that I have portrayed here, they have the rewards, the goals, the supportive peers, the friendly environment is key. Determination, there is an open atmosphere that helps everybody see those goals and keeps them determined. They know why they're doing it. There's no hidden secrets or closed doors. Everybody is aware of what's going on and why it's going on. They see the challenge. They also see the light on the other side and how it's going to be beneficial. They see the opportunity to grow themselves and their companies. And they see the encouragement from the coworkers and the leaders around them. And this is the type of work environment that most Australians breed. Whether you're in lower, middle, or upper management, this is the type of leadership that is encouraged in Australia. Now, moving on to communication. Now, what would any of that be in terms of motivation if we didn't have cultural communication here? This is vital. If you don't communicate what you're thinking or what you want within an organization, how is it going to happen? And this kind of goes back to the open framework I just recently discussed with the motivation factors here. Leaders, subordinates, superiors, everybody is always in constant open communication, and there's never a closed door. It's never do this because I said so. It's do this because this is going to be beneficial to the company as well as yourself. There's always the intrinsic reward and the intrinsic factor with that communication. And that really ultimately brings everybody together. So the communication portion is key. It's not coercive. It's not vindictive. It's not controlling. It's very similar to what Covey would describe in his 7 Habits. It's very much so hear the individual, talk to the individual, help them understand. Even if the decision's been made, you might skip the win-win process where you both agree on something. But at the very least, the leaders will listen, they will understand, and they will communicate so that they can synergize with their subordinates or their superiors. Either way, there's always that synergy there. And that's something I think has helped Australia in the last 100 years or so really grow to their prominence. And it's quite impressive. So, and without further ado, I'm going to move on to kind of where and why I say their growth has been impressive. So if you look back over the last 100 years, you think, they could make a decent amount of progress and they could probably be fairly well seated on the global economic charts between their relationships with other nations and selling their goods and their natural resources. They've actually done surprisingly well. And the reason I say that is because they actually, back in 2016, celebrated their 25th year of being completely recession-free. They beat out the Netherlands, which had that record previously, before they broke this record. That's impressive. You can't grow a nation without the principles that we mentioned prior and reach these types of goals without practicing, not just preaching those principles. So I would say that's definitely a very, very impressive feat. In addition to that, they also have the 12th largest economic power in the world. Yes, the world. And for being such a small country of only about 23 million people, that's very impressive. That shows you the type of workload these people take on every year to help solidify that foundation and that status within the world economy. It also shows you that they're able to implement those same leadership mentalities and leadership skills mentioned prior in their international business with others. So it's definitely something to keep in mind there. For instance, 2016, they did a 1.3 trillion in GDP. So there's definitely, they're a world player, is my point with that. Now, they do also have a strong relationship with the US. They have very strong ties, hence the reason why you would be going over to Australia to implement and fill some of these leadership positions in your firms within that country. And to your own business. As a nation, we consume the larger part of 33% of their GDP. Now, that tells me that out of all the nations in the world that are consuming, we follow shortly after China in regards to the consumption of their goods, which tells me that they also have a very strong tie to us. It's very symbiotic. So it's something to also keep in mind, is that they're really used to managers and leaders from other countries coming over and implementing and growing businesses and nurturing business relationships. They're no strangers to that. So don't be worried about that. Don't be worried it's going to be some sort of unknown territory. You're going to be welcomed, and they're going to help you through the transition process, because they couldn't have gotten to a place where they are now without helping and growing and learning and teaching with others, which is core if you're trying to become a good leader and prominent in your field. So that would be kind of the main things that I would keep in mind in a nutshell in terms of really where you're going to be and what you're going to do, and in keeping in mind all of those facts, and just kind of wrapping up, this last slide here kind of says it all. The leadership techniques, we discussed all of them in the presentation so far, but really wrapping them up, you can see it here in this 4-point section. You see they empower their people, and they empower their people through giving them the resources and the training and the ability through that training to accomplish the goals, and giving them that, yes, we can accomplish this goal together. they inspire their people through that same kind of charismatic leadership. The empowering and the inspiring kind of go hand in hand with the way that they really invest in the individuals and ensure that everybody's treated as equals and everybody's working toward the same vision. They don't, there's no smoke and mirrors. It is what it is. And they show the people why they're doing what they're doing, why they're doing what they're doing, so they can become fully invested and really just accomplish what the business needs them to accomplish for both themselves and for the economy as a whole. And then you also have shared vision. So you have the shared vision, and that the two that I just mentioned, the inspiration and the empowering of people, really comes together to give the corporations that make up this great economy that shared vision. And that shared vision, whatever it might be, is really impressed and instilled within the employees because they see their valuable contributions to that corporation, which helps them really just go far above and beyond where they normally would expect it to be if you were, say, in another country elsewhere. And this finally leads to lasting change. So you have the three components that really come together, and ultimately the effects of this are change. It's lasting change that ultimately impacts not only the individual and the company, but the economy and the country as a whole. And I can say that because if you look at the way Australia has grown and the way they've prospered over the last 100 years, you can clearly see that this model and these leadership techniques used by the Australian people have come to create an economy and a nation that is wealthy and prominent within the world global economy today. So certainly going into this, it's going to be a change, and it's going to be very different than what you're used to in a few different aspects, but at the same time, they're going to use the same skills, they're going to use the same leadership mentalities that you would be used to elsewhere, and really embrace that and really go into it with open arms, hoping to learn and gather as much as you can to help not only yourself and your firm, but also strengthening that relationship between your firm and Australia to ultimately benefit both. So with that, I would like to open the floor to questions and any remarks that anyone might have. And other than that, following presentation, we will go ahead and dismiss, and we'll start on your assignments.